There is a question that has followed Batman through every version of his story. Every comic, every film, every animated series, every novel and graphic novel and radio drama and theatrical adaptation that has ever attempted to contain this character within a narrative frame. The question is not about strength. It is not about wealth or technology or the specific darkness that motivates the mission. The question is this: how does he know? How does a man, one man, without powers, without the gift of supernatural perception, without anything that wasn't earned through effort and discipline and a particular quality of obsessive attention, how does that man look at a crime scene and see what everyone else missed? How does he hold a single thread and follow it through a labyrinth of misdirection and false leads and deliberate deception until it delivers him to the truth? How does he sit across from the most sophisticated criminal minds in the world and already know what they are about to say before they say it? Tonight, we answer that question. Not completely. The answer is not a simple one, and any telling of it that claims to be complete would be lying to you. But substantially, with the care and the patience and the attention to detail that the subject deserves. Tonight, we go into the cases, the specific, documented, mythologized cases that built the reputation, that earned the title, that transformed Bruce Wayne from a man in a costume into something that criminals discuss in whispers when they think no one who matters is listening. The world's greatest detective. That is not a title Bruce Wayne gave himself. That is a title that emerged, organically, gradually, through the accumulated weight of evidence, from the record of what he has done, from the cases solved when no one else could solve them, from the perpetrators identified when every other investigative method had failed, from the moments, and there have been many such moments across many decades of mythology, when a crime that seemed perfect, seemed complete, seemed to have been constructed with enough care that no trail remained, turned out, under Batman's attention, to have left a trail after all. Everything leaves a trail. That is, perhaps, the central conviction of Batman's detective philosophy. Every action, no matter how carefully planned, no matter how deliberately concealed, leaves traces in the world. Because the world is not cooperative with the people who want to erase themselves from it. Physics does not cooperate. Chemistry does not cooperate. The human psychology of the person committing the crime does not cooperate. Because people are not perfect instruments, and imperfect instruments leave marks. Batman looks for the marks. Tonight, we follow him as he finds them. Pull the blanket a little closer. Let the rain do what rain does, fill the space around sound, make the indoors feel more interior, make the outside feel appropriately distant. Let your eyes grow heavy. The first case is waiting. Before we go into specific cases, we need to spend some time with the philosophy. Because Batman's detective work is not simply the application of a technique. It is not a method in the way that a recipe is a method, a set of steps that, followed correctly, always produces the same result. It is something more integrated than that. Something that developed over years of study and practice into a way of seeing, a way of being present in a space, a way of processing information that operates simultaneously at multiple levels, the conscious and the intuitive, the analytical and the aesthetic, the logical and the emotional. And understanding that way of seeing requires understanding where it came from. Bruce Wayne's education as a detective is one of the most extensively documented elements of the Batman mythology. Not in the sense that any single source tells. The whole story, the mythology, is distributed across too many writers, too many decades, too many different visions of the character to be found in one place. but the pieces, assembled carefully, form a coherent picture. A picture of a young man who lost his parents and decided, not immediately, but over time, through the specific alchemy of grief and intelligence and an unusually high tolerance for obsession, that he was going to understand crime. Not just fight it, understand it. There is a distinction there that matters enormously. A person who wants to fight crime needs to be strong and fast and willing. These things can be developed. They are not common, but they are comprehensible. A person who wants to understand crime needs something different. Needs to be able to sit inside the mind of someone who does harmful things and follow the logic, the terrible, often coherent logic that leads a person from wherever they started to wherever the crime happened. Needs to be able to see the world as the perpetrator saw it, without becoming the perpetrator. That particular capacity, empathy without absorption, understanding without endorsement, is one of the rarest qualities in human psychology, and it is the foundation of everything Batman does as a detective. Bruce Wayne left Gotham after his parents were murdered. He was perhaps 14 or 15 years old. Old enough to understand the decision, young enough that the decision had a quality of desperation to it, of a person in enormous pain doing the only thing that felt like movement rather than paralysis. He traveled. This is consistent across every version of the mythology, even if the specific destinations and the specific teachers vary. He traveled for years, many years, 7, 10, 12. The numbers differ, but the essential pattern is constant. He went looking for knowledge, not one kind of knowledge, not the specialized expertise of a martial artist or a forensic scientist or a criminal profiler. All of it. Everything he could find. He trained with masters of physical disciplines whose techniques he would eventually synthesize into the fighting style that no single tradition can fully account for. He studied forensic science and chemistry and anatomy, the technical disciplines of crime scene analysis, the ways that the physical world records what human beings do to it. He studied criminal psychology, spent time in institutions, sat across from people who had done terrible things, and asked them, with genuine curiosity and without flinching, to explain themselves. He studied theater, stage magic, the specific arts of misdirection and illusion, not to use them for entertainment, but to understand them. Because understanding how deception works is essential to seeing through deception. He studied escape artistry, lockpicking, restraint evasion, the mechanics of confinement, skills that would prove immediately useful in his career and that also trained a particular quality of spatial and tactile intelligence. He studied law, not to practice it, but to understand its frameworks, to know the difference between what can be proven and what is true, because these are not always the same thing, and the distinction matters. He studied languages, dozens of them. In the mythology, Bruce Wayne speaks a number of languages that varies depending on the source, but is always many. Because language is access. Because the person who can only speak one language is limited to the fraction of humanity that happens to share that language. And a detective who is limited is a detective with blind spots. He studied everything, with the specific quality of attention that only obsessive grief can sustain. The death of his parents did not just take his parents. It created a need, a consuming, restless, insatiable need to understand, to be capable, to ensure that what happened in that alley never happened without consequence again. That need drove him across the world and back again. And when he returned to Gotham, when the years of training were complete, when he had assembled the education that no conventional institution would ever have offered him, he brought with him not just skills, but something more. a framework, a comprehensive, integrated, deeply personal framework for understanding crime, for seeing it, for following it from its beginning through its middle to its end, and for being present at that end with enough certainty to act. The framework has several components, and before we go into the cases, it is worth naming them. Not as a list. Lists are for documents, and tonight is not a document, but as a description, a slow, careful description of the way a particular kind of mind moves through the world. The first component is observation. This sounds obvious. Of course, a detective observes. What else would a detective do? But observation in Batman's framework is not casual. It is not the ordinary ambient noticing that most people do as they move through space. It is active, deliberate, comprehensive. Batman entering a crime scene is not the same as anyone else entering a crime scene. He is not walking through a space looking for what is obviously significant. He is cataloguing everything, every object, every surface, every smell, every sound, every detail of the space itself and how it relates to the surrounding environment. He is asking, simultaneously, several questions. What is here that should not be here? What is not here that should be here? What has been moved? What has been cleaned? What has been preserved? And why? These are different questions, subtly but importantly different. The first is the obvious one, the question every detective asks, looking for what doesn't belong. But the second, what is absent, requires a prior knowledge of what should be present, requires having a model of the normal state of a space in order to recognize its abnormal state. And the third and fourth questions, what has been moved, what has been cleaned, require something even more specific, require the ability to read the traces of action rather than the action itself. The scene is not the crime. The scene is what the crime left behind, and those two things are different in ways that matter. The second component of the framework is memory. Batman's memory is one of the most consistently emphasized elements of his detective capability across the mythology. Not just good memory, exceptional memory. The kind of memory that retains not just facts, but context, that stores information in a way that makes it accessible not just as isolated data, but as a web of relationships. This has a specific name in the mythology, the memory palace, the ancient technique known in various forms across multiple cultures of associating information with specific spatial locations, imagining a familiar space and placing the things you need to remember in specific locations within it, so that the act of mentally moving through the space retrieves the information. Batman's version of this technique is, in the mythology, extraordinarily developed. Not just a palace, but a city, an internal model of Gotham itself, and perhaps beyond, in which information is stored with a density and a precision that approaches the computational. When he encounters a new piece of information, a detail from a crime scene, a behavioral observation from an interview, a technical fact from a forensic analysis, he does not simply note it. He places it. He situates it within the web of everything he already knows, checking for connections, for consistencies, for contradictions. And this means that old information is never truly old. It remains accessible. It can be retrieved and tested against new information in real time. The third component is deduction, which is not the same thing as logic, although it includes logic. Deduction is the movement from evidence to conclusion, but the specific quality of good deduction, the kind that produces accurate conclusions rather than plausible-sounding ones, requires something that pure logic does not require. It requires the willingness to be wrong. This is counterintuitive. We think of detective work as a process of accumulating certainty, of moving from confusion toward clarity, from not knowing toward knowing. And it is that. But it is also, paradoxically, a process of sustaining uncertainty, of holding a theory loosely enough that new evidence can change it, of not falling in love with a conclusion before the evidence fully supports it. The best detectives, in fiction and in reality, share this quality. They generate hypotheses readily and discard them readily. They are not attached to being right. They are attached to finding out what actually happened. These two things feel like the same thing, but they are not. A detective attached to being right will unconsciously filter evidence, will give more weight to what supports their theory and less to what complicates it. A detective attached to the truth will do the opposite, will actively seek what complicates the theory, because complications are where the truth usually lives. Batman is, in the mythology, firmly in the second category. He generates theories quickly and tests them ruthlessly. He pursues the thing that doesn't fit before he pursues the things that do, because what doesn't fit is where the case lives. The fourth component: empathy. Not a word that is often associated with Batman in popular depictions of the character. The popular version of Batman is the solitary, emotionally contained, borderline cold figure who works best alone and has difficulty sustaining ordinary human connection. And that version is not entirely wrong. But it misses something essential, because the capacity to understand what a criminal was thinking, to follow the logic of an action from the inside, to reconstruct not just what happened, but why it felt necessary to the person who made it happen, that capacity requires a genuine engagement with human interiority. It requires the ability to feel, provisionally and temporarily, what another person felt, without judgment suppressing the access, without disgust closing the door. Batman can do this. It costs him something. It always costs something to enter a mind that has decided the world is something to be taken from, or damaged, or controlled. To understand that decision from the inside, even temporarily. But he does it, because the alternative, staying outside, remaining safely uninvested, produces a detective who sees only surfaces. And surfaces are where crimes are committed. The truth is always deeper. Batman did not arrive in Gotham as the finished article. This is one of the things that the mythology handles with varying degrees of awareness, depending on the writer and the era. Some versions of the character present him as essentially complete from the beginning, fully formed, fully capable, the definitive detective from his very first case. But the more honest and more interesting versions acknowledge the learning curve. The early cases were not the masterworks. They were the exercises, the rough drafts, the cases that built the methodology through practice rather than producing it fully formed. And in them, in the mistakes and the near misses and the conclusions that almost went wrong, we can see the detective becoming. The mythology gives us glimpses of early Batman that are worth dwelling on. Not the triumphant moments, those come later, and we will get to them. But the moments of uncertainty, the moments where the answer was not clear and the wrong turn was genuinely possible. In the earliest period of his career, the first months, perhaps the first year, Batman operated in Gotham with a style that was more physical than analytical. He was remarkable, even then. The training had produced an extraordinary capability. He could handle himself in any physical situation Gotham's criminal landscape was likely to produce. But the detective element, the specific quality of investigative insight that would eventually define him, was still being calibrated. There are accounts, in the mythological record of the early cases, of cases where he knew who had committed a crime before he knew why. And the why, he came to understand, matters as much as the who. Because the why tells you whether your identification of the who is correct. because a conclusion about identity that is not supported by a coherent explanation of motive is a conclusion that may be wrong. The early Batman sometimes got the right answer for the wrong reasons, which is, in investigative terms, almost as dangerous as getting the wrong answer. Almost. Not quite. A right answer for the wrong reason still stops the crime, but it doesn't build the methodology. The early cases taught him to always ask why, not just who, not just how. Why? Let us talk about the case of the Gotham Harbor murders. This is a case from the early mythology, from the period when Batman was new enough to Gotham's criminal world that his methods were not yet understood or anticipated by the people he was investigating. 3 men were found in the harbor over a period of 6 weeks. Each had been in the harbor for approximately the same length of time before discovery. Each had died from the same cause, drowning, with evidence of prior restraint. The Gotham City Police Department, in the specific form that existed in the early mythology, before Gordon's influence had fully reformed it, treated these as connected deaths, likely organized crime, likely related to the dock workers' disputes that had been roiling the waterfront for months. They were not wrong that the deaths were connected. They were significantly wrong about why. Batman came to the case from a different angle, not through the GCPD's investigation. His relationship with the department in those early years was adversarial rather than collaborative, but through his own surveillance of the harbor district. He had noticed something that the official investigation had not noted, or had noted and then filed away as irrelevant. The 3 victims had no connection to the dock workers' dispute. None. Not as participants, not as observers, not as collateral damage of the conflict's escalating violence. They were connected to each other. But the connection was not the waterfront. It was a different building, a different street, a different context entirely, one that the official investigation had not examined, because the official investigation had committed too early to the dock dispute theory and was no longer asking open questions. This is one of the most common failure modes in detective work: premature closure, the commitment to a theory before the evidence fully supports it. Once a theory is adopted, once an investigative team has organized its resources and its attention around a particular explanation, the human tendency is to look for confirmation of that explanation rather than alternatives to it. Batman, at this point in his development, was still learning to resist this tendency in himself, but he had already learned to exploit it in others. The 3 victims, he discovered, had all been witnesses to something. Not participants, not perpetrators. Witnesses. An event that had occurred 8 months prior to the first body, far enough in the past that the connection was not obvious, far enough that anyone constructing the case timeline would naturally focus on the period immediately before the deaths, rather than looking much further back. They had seen something that someone with power, not organized, crime power, but civic power, the power of position and reputation and institutional standing, had decided they could not be permitted to discuss. The case resolved in a way that is, in retrospect, illustrative of what Batman would become. Not a dramatic physical confrontation, not a chase across the harbor's infrastructure, not the kind of resolution that looks spectacular from the outside. He identified the person responsible, assembled the evidence with the specific attention to chain of custody that would make it useful rather than simply true, and delivered it to the one officer in the GCPD he had identified as genuinely incorruptible. James Gordon. Even then, even in those early days, before the signal and before the rooftop meetings and before the relationship became one of the defining partnerships of the mythology. Gordon arrested the person responsible. The case was closed. And Batman filed away what he had learned. About the danger of premature closure, about the importance of timeline, of looking further back than the obvious search window, about the difference between the explanation that fits the most obvious evidence and the explanation that fits all of it. Every case is a lesson. The early cases were lessons about the basics, but the basics, applied consistently and with discipline, produce something remarkable over time. Before we go further into the case histories, we need to address something, a complication, a specific problem that Batman's detective methodology encounters and that no other aspect of his preparation fully addresses. The problem of irrational actors. Detective work, at its most systematic, at its most classical, operates on an assumption so fundamental that it is rarely made explicit because it rarely needs to be. The assumption that the person who committed the crime had a reason. Not necessarily a good reason, not necessarily a reason that most people would recognize as valid or proportionate or comprehensible, but a reason, a logic, an internal coherence, however distorted, that connects the action to a goal. Follow the money, follow the motive. Find the person who wanted something that the crime provided, and you find the person who committed the crime. This works for most crimes. It works for the vast majority of what Batman encounters in Gotham's remarkably crowded criminal landscape. The Penguin's crimes are motivated by profit and by a specific and consuming need for social recognition. Two-Face's crimes follow the logic, however warped, of his psychological damage, his obsession with duality. The Riddler's crimes are motivated by the need to demonstrate intellectual superiority. Ra's al Ghul's crimes are motivated by ideology, by a vision of the world that most would reject, but that has an internal consistency. These are detectable, these are trackable, because they have logic. The Joker does not have logic. Or rather, the Joker has something that resembles logic in the same way that a funhouse mirror resembles a mirror. It reflects, but what it reflects is distorted in specific, deliberate, and deeply unsettling ways. The Joker problem is the hardest problem Batman's detective mind faces, and it is worth spending time with, not to solve it, because it cannot be fully solved, but to understand what it reveals about the limits and the nature of the detective methodology itself. A conventional criminal investigation works by reconstructing intent. You look at what happened and you ask, who had reason to want this outcome? With the Joker, the outcome is often not the actual intent, or the intent shifts, or what appeared to be the goal turns out to be a distraction from a different goal that was the real objective, or the distraction was the objective, or there was no clear demarcation between distraction and objective because the person constructing the plan does not make that kind of distinction. Batman has described, in the mythology, in moments of rare, direct reflection, the specific cognitive experience of working a Joker case. It is, he suggests, not like working a puzzle. A puzzle has a solution. The pieces are designed to fit together in a specific way, and the process of solving the puzzle is the process of discovering that specific arrangement. Working a Joker case is more like working a puzzle where the pieces were designed by someone who wanted you to think there was a solution, where the piece that seems to complete the picture is deliberately shaped to almost fit, close enough to convince you that you're on the right track, wrong enough that when you apply it, something fails. The Joker doesn't want to be understood. He wants to be engaged with. He wants the act of pursuit, Batman's specific quality of focused, intelligent, relentless pursuit, because that pursuit is, to him, the closest thing to genuine interaction that he experiences. This changes the nature of the detective work. When you understand that the goal is not to solve the puzzle, because the puzzle is designed to resist solving, but to interrupt the process, to get ahead of it, to find the point where the pattern breaks and apply intervention there. Batman's approach to Joker cases evolved, over the years of the mythology, from standard investigative method towards something more like pattern disruption. Not following the logic, not reconstructing the intent, but identifying the shape of the escalation and finding the place where it must pass through a bottleneck, a moment, a location, a dependency, and being at that bottleneck before the Joker arrives. It is, in a strange way, more intuitive and less analytical than his standard approach. It requires a kind of empathy that goes even deeper than his ordinary case empathy. A genuine engagement with a kind of mind that is profoundly alien to his own, not because it is simpler, but because it operates according to entirely different values. The Joker thinks the rules are funny. Batman's whole philosophy rests on the proposition that the rules, properly applied, genuinely upheld, are the difference between civilization and chaos. To understand the Joker is to temporarily inhabit a perspective that finds that proposition absurd. Batman can do this. He doesn't like it, but he can do it. And the capacity to do it, to go that far into a way of thinking that is antithetical to his own and come back out again, intact, with something useful, is one of the things that most clearly marks him as exceptional. Not the physical capability, the psychological flexibility. The ability to be, temporarily, something he would never choose to be, in the service of understanding it well enough to stop it. If the Joker represents the hardest test of Batman's detective capability, the test that pushes the methodology to its limits and sometimes beyond them, then the Riddler represents something different. The Riddler represents the purest test, because Edward Nygma, the man who became the Riddler, whose specific psychological damage takes the specific form of being unable to commit a crime without also providing the means of solving it, is, in his own way, an ideal detective opponent. He is brilliant, genuinely, substantively brilliant. Not the self-proclaimed brilliance of someone who wants to appear intelligent, but the real thing. A mind that processes information at a speed and with a connectivity that puts him in the highest percentile of human cognitive capability. He is also, in the mythology, in genuine psychological pain. The compulsion, the need to leave the riddle, to sign the crime with a puzzle that can, in principle, be solved, is not strategic. It is not a choice he makes after calculating that the risks are acceptable. It is a compulsion in the most specific sense. He cannot not do it. The crime, without the riddle, feels to him incomplete, formless, not real. He needs to be understood, not caught, not defeated, understood. And the riddle is the mechanism through which he reaches for that, the public demonstration of his intelligence, the proof that his mind is what he believes it to be. Batman's relationship with the Riddler cases is, in the mythology, complex and interesting in ways that a surface reading of the stories might miss. Because at one level, the Riddler cases are the most straightforward. The perpetrator tells you what he's going to do. He encodes the information, but he provides the encoding. He gives you the puzzle, and he gives you, somewhere within the puzzle itself, the means to solve it. All you have to do is be smart enough. And that, for Batman, is not really a limiting condition. But at a deeper level, the Riddler cases are something else. They are a specific kind of engagement, an invitation almost, a demand that the other person show up with their full capability and engage on the Riddler's terms. And this creates a dynamic that Batman has to be careful about. The dynamic is this: if you engage on those terms, if you accept the invitation, play the game, solve the riddle, and arrive at the appointed place and time, you have, in some sense, done exactly what the Riddler wanted. He has controlled the investigation. He has determined the pace, the direction, the sequence of events. You have solved his puzzle, which is satisfying both to you and to him, but you have also, in the process, demonstrated that you operate within a framework he constructed. Batman eventually developed a response to this, not a way of avoiding the riddles. They cannot be avoided. Ignoring them means missing the information they contain and arriving at the crime scene too late, or not at all. But a way of engaging with them that does not entirely concede the initiative. He began solving the riddles backward, not starting from the riddle and working toward the answer, which is what the Riddler expected and had calibrated the difficulty for, starting from what was known about the Riddler's operational patterns and working backward toward the riddle, arriving at the solution from a direction the Riddler had not anticipated. Because the Riddler, for all his brilliance, has patterns. Compulsions produce patterns. The same psychological structure that makes him leave riddles also makes those riddles consistent in specific ways, in the kind of wordplay he prefers, in the categories of reference he draws from, in the structural complexity he finds satisfying. Batman catalogued those patterns, over many cases, over many riddles, building a database of Nigma's specific cognitive signature, the things that were distinctively his, the fingerprints of his intelligence. And then, when a new riddle arrived, he didn't just solve the riddle, he solved the Riddler. He used the pattern to narrow the solution space, to identify, before he had fully worked through the encoding, the categories of answer that were consistent with Nigma's profile. This infuriated the Riddler, genuinely, profoundly. Because what Batman had done was take the arena that the Riddler controlled, the realm of his own superior intelligence, and demonstrate that it was knowable, that the brilliance, for all its genuine power, was also predictable. To a person whose psychological identity is built on being exceptional, on being the smartest person in any room, on the idea that his mind operates according to principles that others cannot follow, the discovery that his mind has been mapped is devastating. The Riddler, in the best versions of these stories, does not simply lose to Batman. He loses in a specific way that costs him something. That reaches the psychological wound that drives the whole performance. And this is one of the things that distinguishes Batman's detective work from simple competence. Not just solving the case, understanding what the case means to the person who created it. And using that understanding not cruelly, not to wound deliberately, but to reach the truth through the most direct available route. Let us talk about a specific Riddler case, one of the more celebrated in the mythology. The case that involved the museum. The Gotham Museum of Natural History, a building that exists in the mythology as one of the city's genuine cultural anchors. Vast, old, extraordinarily wealthy in its collections. The kind of institution that accumulates objects from across human history and houses them in the particular atmosphere of preserved grandeur that the best museums produce. The Riddler sent a riddle. He always sent a riddle. This one was layered, more so than usual, even for him. 3 separate components, each requiring a different kind of knowledge to decode. The first component was linguistic, a wordplay construction that pointed toward a category rather than a specific location. The second was mathematical, a sequence that, when interpreted correctly, produced a set of coordinates within the first category. The third was historical, a reference to a specific event that, to someone with the right knowledge, immediately indicated a date. Category. Location within category. Time. The Riddler, at his best, did not leave simple riddles. He left 3-dimensional ones. Batman decoded it in 11 minutes, not because it was easy, because he had been studying Edward Nygma for years by this point, and the specific flavor of the encoding, the particular way the wordplay was constructed, the specific mathematical sequence type, the historical period that Nigma's references consistently drew from, told him things about the solution before he had fully worked through the mechanics. He arrived at the museum 4 hours before the event the riddle had predicted. 4 hours. In the dark, in an empty museum, among the preserved artifacts of human history, waiting for someone who was also, in his specific way, trying to preserve something, his own sense of himself as the most interesting mind in Gotham. What happened when the Riddler arrived is instructive. Not for the physical confrontation, there was one, and Batman handled it, which is expected and not particularly interesting, but for the moment before it. The moment when the Riddler walked into the room where he expected to find an empty museum and found instead that Batman was already there. Already there, waiting, in exactly the location and at exactly the moment that the riddle had specified. The Riddler stopped, and in that pause, in that specific, waited pause before the physical event began, something happened between them that the mythology captures differently in different tellings, but that always contains the same essential quality: recognition. The Riddler recognizing that he had been read. Not just this riddle, not just this specific encoding. Himself, his patterns, the way his mind moves. The most intimate thing you can do to a person, more intimate than any physical act, is to understand how they think, to follow the specific, idiosyncratic path their mind takes through information and arrive at the destination they were heading for before they get there. It is the detective's most profound act, and it is also, for the person being understood, the most exposing experience imaginable. There is a category of case in Batman's mythology that is rarely discussed as detective work, but it is, in some ways, the most profound demonstration of the methodology. The cases where Bruce Wayne has had to investigate himself. Not literally himself as a suspect. Not cases where he was accused of crimes he didn't commit, though those exist in the mythology and are interesting for different reasons, but cases where the subject of investigation was his own history, his own psychology, his own capacity to trust the conclusions he reached when those conclusions touched the deepest, most defended areas of his interior life. The death of his parents. This is the bedrock of everything, the event that created Batman, that built the need, that drove the years of training and the decades of work. And it is also, in the mythology, a case, a specific, documented, investigable crime. Joe Chill shot Thomas and Martha Wayne in Crime Alley. This is the foundational fact, the thing that is established and consistent across every version of the mythology. But in the deeper mythology, in the versions that take the detective seriously rather than treating the origin story as simply backdrop, questions accumulate. Was it random? Was it coincidence? The specific, catastrophic coincidence that sends a family into an alley at the wrong moment in front of the wrong person? Or was it arranged? The mythology has entertained both possibilities, and the psychological burden of entertaining the second possibility, of investigating the possibility that his parents' murder was not random, that it was planned, that there were people behind Joe Chill who had reasons, that those reasons might connect to structures that Bruce Wayne has been dealing with ever since, is enormous. Because investigating that possibility requires the detective to apply his methodology to the event he is most invested in, to the case where objectivity is hardest, to the evidence that touches the wound that everything else is built on. A detective who wants an answer, who needs a specific answer, is a detective in danger of finding exactly the answer they need, whether or not That is the true answer. Bruce Wayne knows this. He knows it abstractly from his training. He knows it practically from decades of field work. And he knows it personally, in the most uncomfortable and visceral way, because when he investigates anything touching his parents' death, he can feel the pull. The specific gravitational pull of what he needs to be true. His greatest detective work may be the work he does on himself. The constant, ongoing, never fully completed project of checking his own conclusions against the evidence. Of asking, when he reaches a finding that feels certain, is this true? Or is this just the shape that I need it to be? There is a specific version of this in the mythology, a case that has been revisited and reinterpreted across several different eras of Batman storytelling that involves discovering information about his father, Thomas Wayne. Thomas Wayne in the primary mythology is a figure of almost pure virtue, a doctor, a philanthropist, a man who used the Wayne fortune not for self-aggrandizement, but for genuine civic benefit. A father who was, by every account, present and warm and genuinely invested in his son's well-being. The loss of this figure, the particular quality of the loss, the combination of grief and idealization that childhood bereavement tends to produce, is foundational to Bruce Wayne's psychology. And then there are the other versions. The mythology has, at various points, introduced complications, suggestions, some more developed than others, some more integral to the main narrative than others, that Thomas Wayne was not entirely what he appeared. Not that he was evil. The mythology is generally not interested in that simple a reversal, but that he existed in contexts that Bruce Wayne, as a child, could not have understood. That he made choices, some of them compromised, some of them the kind of choices that are available only to people with power, and that power makes possible in ways that are not available to everyone, that do not fit cleanly into the idealized portrait. How does a detective investigate his own father? With the same methodology. That is the only honest answer. With the same commitment to following evidence where it leads, regardless of where that is. Bruce Wayne has done this. In the mythology, in the moments where this specific investigation is depicted, he follows it with the same discipline he brings to everything else. He finds what he finds. He sits with it. He does not suppress it or explain it away or retreat into the comfortable version of the story. He integrates it into a picture of his father that is more complex than the child's memory, more human, in the specific sense that human beings are never the idealized versions of themselves that grief creates. This is, in its way, the detective's most heroic act. Not the physical courage, not the intellectual brilliance. The willingness to find out what is true, even when what is true might cost you the story you've been living inside. The willingness to update the self, to let the evidence change not just what you think happened, but who you think you are in relation to it. Now we go into the canon, into the cases that the mythology has elevated through retelling, through reference, through the specific way that characters in the story speak about them, to the status of legend. The cases that, in Gotham's fictional history, are spoken of the way real history speaks of its most remarkable investigative achievements, with the recognition that what happened here was not normal, that the person who solved this case demonstrated something beyond ordinary capability. These are the cases that made the title real, the case of the laughing murders. This case, encountered in multiple forms across the mythology, though the details shift between tellings, involves a series of deaths in which the victims are found in a state that suggests death came while they were laughing. Not the Joker's toxin. This is important. The immediate assumption, and it is a reasonable assumption given the Joker's well-documented methods, was that this was Joker-related. The GCPD began from that premise. The early investigation focused on it. Batman began from a different premise. Or rather, he did not begin from any premise. This is the distinction. The GCPD had a hypothesis before they had fully examined the evidence. Batman examined the evidence first and formed hypotheses after. What the evidence showed, on close examination, was inconsistent with the Joker's known methodology in several specific ways. The victims were not chosen at random, or, if they were, the randomness had a pattern. They were all connected to a specific industry, a specific corner of Gotham's economy. The method of death, while superficially similar to Joker toxin effects, had a different chemical signature. Not dramatically different, close enough that a cursory examination would not catch it. But under the specific analysis that Batman's equipment could perform, the difference was real and significant. And the timing. The murders were not opportunistic. They were scheduled. The interval between deaths was not random. It was precise. So precise that it suggested either extraordinary coincidence or deliberate planning. Planning requires a planner with a goal connected to the victims. Batman worked the connection between victims first, not the method, not the timing, the victims. Because the connection between victims is where motive lives, and motive is the beginning of the story, the thing from which everything else follows. What he found was a financial dispute, old, complicated, involving several layers of corporate structure specifically designed to make the underlying reality difficult to trace. A dispute over a patent, something that had been worth, at the time of the original disagreement, relatively little. Something that had become, due to changes in technology and market conditions over the intervening years, worth an enormous amount. The victims were people who stood between a specific person and that enormous amount. Not in a simple linear way, in a complex, distributed way. The kind of distribution that sophisticated financial planning produces when the goal is to ensure that a claim is valid regardless of what happens to any single piece of it. Batman traced the connections, through corporate records, through financial filings, through the specific, meticulous work of following money through structures designed to obscure it, a process that took time and required a kind of patient, systematic attention that is unglamorous but essential. The person responsible was not a criminal in any prior record, no history of violence, no connection to Gotham's established criminal infrastructure, no profile that the GCPD's investigation, which had been focused on organized crime and on the Joker, would have generated. A businessman, successful, respectable, the kind of person who attended the right fundraisers and sat on the right boards, and whose face appeared in the society pages in the kinds of photographs that suggest permanence and good standing. Who had decided, after years of watching something that was rightfully his, in his understanding, and the understanding had enough legal complexity behind it to be at least arguable, being controlled by others, that the only solution was to change who controlled it. And who had constructed the method, the modified compound, the scheduling, the deliberate invocation of the Joker as a red herring, with a sophistication that demonstrated he had planned it for a long time. Batman found him. Not through a dramatic confrontation. The case had no dramatic confrontation. The resolution was quiet. Evidence assembled, delivered, processed. An arrest that looked, to anyone who didn't know the backstory, entirely ordinary. But the case established something. It established that Batman's methodology worked not just on the exotic, not just on supervillains with elaborate signatures and theatrical presentations, but on the invisible crime. The crime that is designed to look like something else. The crime that hides inside respectability and uses misdirection as its primary defense. The crime that tells you to look over there. And Batman looks here. The case of the vanished architect. This case exists in the mythology in a form that is less action-oriented than most Batman stories, and it is better for it. It is a pure detective story in the classical sense. A disappearance, an absence of obvious evidence, and a solution that required not physical capability, but sustained intellectual engagement with a very specific kind of puzzle. An architect named, in the mythology, Garrison Slate had been working on a project for a prominent Gotham developer. A significant project, the kind of project that changes a neighborhood, that brings in money and attention and transforms what was old and organic into something new and deliberate. He disappeared. Not dramatically, not with signs of struggle or evidence of violence. He was present one evening and absent the next morning, and his absence had the quality, immediately recognized by anyone who had looked at enough cases, of being deliberate. A deliberate vanishing, which is different from an abduction, different from a flight, different from the various other categories of disappearance. It had the specific texture of a person who had decided to stop existing, not to die, to simply cease. But something was wrong with it. Batman noticed it immediately, in the apartment, in the specific way the absence was arranged. A deliberate vanishing, a genuine one, by a person making a genuine choice, has a particular signature. It shows the evidence of decision, of preparation, of the specific emotional quality of someone saying goodbye to a life, even silently. This didn't have that quality. The apartment had been arranged to appear like a deliberate vanishing, but the arrangement was wrong in small ways that were only visible to someone who had studied enough genuine cases of voluntary disappearance to know what they actually looked like from the inside. A detail too neat, an absence too complete. The specific way that personal objects were present or missing that suggested arrangement rather than selection. Someone had staged this. Someone who knew enough to make it look right, but not quite enough to make it actually look right. Batman investigated the project, the development project that Garrison Slate had been working on. And what he found, buried in the architectural plans, in the structural documents, in the technical specifications that most people interacting with this project would never think to examine because they required a specific kind of expertise to read, was a problem. A structural problem, significant, of the kind that, if the building were constructed as specified, would have implications. Not immediately, not dramatically, but over time, in the specific, patient way that structural problems in buildings reveal themselves. Garrison Slate had found it and had understood its implications, and had made the mistake, the specific, fatal mistake that people with integrity sometimes make, of saying so to the wrong person. The developer, who had commitments, financial commitments, timelines, investors who were expecting returns by specific dates, relationships with city officials who had expedited permits on the understanding that the project would proceed, who had decided that the problem Garrison Slate identified was a problem that could be managed by removing Garrison Slate. Batman found him, Garrison Slate, alive, in a location that the investigation of the development project eventually led to, through a chain of connections that required patience and specificity and the particular kind of following through that gets tedious before it gets productive. He was alive, and the building was stopped, before the concrete was poured, before the structural floor was embedded in something that would stand for decades, and that would eventually, in the most prosaic and terrible of ways, demonstrate what Garrison Slate had tried to tell someone. This is one of the less celebrated types of Batman case in the popular imagination. No supervillain, no dramatic toxin, no elaborate trap. Just a missing person, an architectural document, and a chain of investigative reasoning that saved a life and prevented a different kind of catastrophe. But it is, in some ways, more representative of what the detective work actually is than the theatrical confrontations. The patient, unglamorous, systematically competent work of following information where it leads. One of the most important but least discussed aspects of Batman's detective capability is the archive. Not the Bat computer specifically, though that is part of it. The mental archive. The comprehensive, constantly updated psychological profiles of every significant criminal in Gotham's ecosystem. This is a kind of detective work that does not produce dramatic resolutions in the moment. It is the slow, patient work that makes the dramatic resolutions in the moment possible. Batman maintains, in the mythology, consistently and across every version of the character that takes the detective element seriously, detailed psychological profiles of the people he deals with. Not just what they do, who they are, the specific structure of their psychological damage, the needs that drive the crimes, the fears that shape the methods, the history, as much of it as can be assembled, that connects the person who commits crimes today to the person who was formed by experiences they did not choose. This is not therapeutic. Batman is not trying to heal anyone. But understanding a person's psychology well enough to predict their behavior, to know when a particular stimulus enters their environment, what response it is likely to produce, is one of the most practically powerful tools available to a detective. It is the difference between reacting and anticipating, between arriving at the crime scene and being there before the crime happens. Let us walk through some of the profiles. Not all of them. Gotham's villain population is, in the mythology, remarkably populated, and a complete survey would take more time than we have. But the most important ones, the ones whose profiles are most developed and most revelatory about what the profiling process actually involves. Harvey Dent, Two-Face. The profile of Harvey Dent is one of the most complex in Batman's archive. Not because the behavior pattern is complex. It is, in fact, more rule-governed than most. The coin, the duality, the specific way decisions are made and crimes are structured. The complexity is in the history. Because Harvey Dent was not always a villain. He was, before the specific catastrophe that produced Two-Face, one of the most respected figures in Gotham's legal establishment. A district attorney with an extraordinary record, a genuine commitment to justice, a friend. Bruce Wayne's friend. This complicates the profiling in ways that Batman has had to acknowledge, because the profile of an enemy is one thing. It can be maintained at a certain analytical distance. The profile of someone you knew before the damage, someone you have access to not just through investigative records but through personal memory, requires a different kind of discipline. The temptation is to profile Harvey Dent and see him as the exception, as the injury superimposed on the person rather than the person restructured by the injury. To see Two-Face as something that happened to Harvey Dent, an external event, like a disease. Batman has had to be honest with himself about this, about the degree to which what Harvey Dent became was not simply imposed from outside, but grew in some proportion from something that was already present. That the binary thinking, the inability to tolerate ambiguity, the need for clean divisions between good and evil, was visible in Harvey Dent before the acid. Less extreme, more controlled, but present. This is uncomfortable. It implicates the person Bruce Wayne knew. It complicates the grief. But it also produces a more accurate profile. And a more accurate profile produces better predictions. The Two-Face profile in Batman's archive incorporates both layers. The layer that is Harvey Dent, the intelligence, the legal training, the specific quality of the commitment to fairness that now expresses itself in such distorted form. And the layer that is Two-Face, the damage, the compulsion, the specific rules that govern behavior now that ordinary rule following has been replaced by the coin. Understanding both layers allows Batman to predict not just what Two-Face will do, but when the rule will be followed and when the person underneath it will reassert himself. To find the moments where Harvey Dent is still present inside Two-Face, and to target those moments. Poison Ivy, Pamela Isley. A different kind of profile, a different kind of psychological architecture. The standard reading of Poison Ivy, in the mythology, in the broader cultural understanding of the character, is that she represents a kind of ecological extremism, a radical prioritization of plant life over human life, a green ideology pushed past the point of civilization into something that most people would regard as pathological. Batman's profile goes deeper than this, because the standard reading tells you what she does. It doesn't tell you why. The why in the profile is about a specific kind of loss that the character of Pamela Isley carries, a loss of faith, not in a religious sense, but in a very specific social sense, a point at which the mechanisms of ordinary human connection failed her in ways that were specific and consequential. And into that gap, the gap left by the failure of human connection, came something else, something that did not fail, something consistent, predictable, and responsive in ways that human beings are often not. Plants do not betray. Plants do not make promises and then break them. Plants do not have the specific human capacity for cruelty that comes from intelligence combined with indifference. Understanding this does not make Poison Ivy's actions any less dangerous, but it tells Batman something important about the pressure points, about the conditions under which she is most likely to escalate and the conditions under which de-escalation is possible, about the specific approach, in tone, in content, in the acknowledgement of certain things that matter to her, that is most likely to produce a moment of engagement rather than a moment of conflict. The profile is not just a threat assessment, it is a communication guide, a map of how to reach the person inside the danger. This is, perhaps, the most human element of Batman's detective work, the recognition that the people he deals with are people, that the archive he maintains is not just a tactical resource, but a kind of knowledge about human beings, about the things that break them and the things that hold. Not every case is resolved cleanly. This is one of the things that the best Batman stories understand, and the worst ones don't. The mythology, at its most honest, acknowledges that the detective's work is not a series of complete solutions, not a sequence of problems neatly closed. Some cases leave residue. Some cases produce answers that are true, but that carry a cost, that resolve the immediate question, but open a different one that has no good resolution. Some cases are never solved. And some cases, the ones that matter most, live inside Batman for the rest of his life. Not as failures necessarily, but as weights, things he carries. The case of Jason Todd is not, strictly speaking, a detective case. It is a case in the emotional sense, in the sense that it is a problem that Bruce Wayne has tried, with the specific tools of the detective mind, to process and understand. Jason Todd was the second Robin, a boy who came to the role with different energy than Dick Grayson, more raw, more angry, more directly connected to the specific violence that Gotham inflicts on the people it abandons. He died. The mythology around this is specific and has its own complex history. In the comics, the readers voted on the outcome, which is itself one of the stranger moments in superhero mythology, and one that the stories have had to metabolize in various ways. But within the story, Jason Todd died at the hands of the Joker. Bruce Wayne could not have prevented it. This is the conclusion that the evidence supports. The timeline, the geography, the specific sequence of events. Everything indicates that even with different decisions at certain junctures, the outcome was not one he could have changed. He has reached this conclusion. He has examined it with the same rigor he applies to everything else, has assembled the evidence, has run through the decision tree, has identified every juncture where a different choice might have produced a different result. The conclusion is the same every time. He could not have prevented it. And yet, the detective mind does not stop because it has reached a conclusion. The detective mind keeps running, keeps looking for what it missed, keeps asking whether the methodology was applied correctly, whether the evidence was interpreted accurately, whether the conclusion that the evidence supports is the conclusion that is actually true. This is the curse of the particular kind of intelligence that Batman represents. It does not turn off. It cannot be told that the analysis is complete and that further inquiry is not warranted. It continues. And in the case of Jason Todd, it continues through the night. Through many nights. Through whatever version of sleep Bruce Wayne manages to achieve, which is rarely enough and rarely complete. He has memorized the timeline, not because memorizing it produces anything new. It doesn't, and he knows it doesn't. But because the specific, systematic act of going through it is the only thing that feels like action in the face of something that happened and cannot be unhappened. This is not detective work, or rather, it is detective work that has exceeded its proper domain, that has moved from the investigation of external events into something more like a psychological loop. A place where the methodology, which serves Batman so well everywhere else, turns in on itself and becomes something he cannot think his way out of. The mythology handles this in different ways. Some versions of the character do not dwell in it, treat Jason Todd's death as a motivating tragedy and move on, the way action narratives tend to move on from losses. The more honest versions let Bruce Wayne carry it, let it change him, let it alter his relationship with the subsequent Robins, the increased caution, the difficulty of allowing anyone to stand beside him in the work, the specific grief-related behavioral patterns that anyone who has studied loss would recognize. And in the versions where Jason Todd returns, as Red Hood, as a figure of genuine moral complexity who challenges everything Bruce Wayne thought he understood about justice and violence and what the mission is actually for, the case reopens. Not the case of the death, a different case, a harder one. The case of what to do when the person you were trying to protect comes back changed. When the boy you failed is now a man who has concluded from the experience of your failure that your methods are wrong, that the restraint is not integrity but cowardice, that the refusal to cross certain lines is not ethics but sentimentality. How does the detective investigate that? How does he look at someone who has reasons, genuine, substantive, painful reasons for the position they hold, and engage with those reasons honestly without abandoning the position he has held for decades? This is not a case with a forensic solution. There is no body to examine, no financial record to trace, no psychological profile to consult. It is a conversation, a long, painful, never fully resolved conversation that the mythology has been having with itself for decades, about what justice means, about what cost is acceptable, about the specific moral logic of refusing to kill the people who kill, and whether that refusal is principled or is, in some darker way, about something else entirely. Batman has not answered this question completely. The mythology has not answered it completely. And the inability to answer it completely is, in itself, something like an answer. There is a category of Batman's detective work that is rarely treated as detective work: the investigation of Gotham itself. The city is not just the setting of the cases. In the mythology, in the best and most thoughtful versions of it, Gotham is itself a subject of investigation, a thing to be understood, to be read, the way a detective reads a scene. Why is Gotham the way it is? This is not a rhetorical question. The mythology treats it as a genuine investigative puzzle, a question with specific, discoverable, historically documented answers that Batman has, across the years of the mythology, spent considerable effort assembling. Not because the answer changes what he does on a case-by-case basis, but because understanding a city, its structure, its history, the specific ways that money and power and corruption and genuine civic aspiration have interacted over generations to produce the place it is now, is essential to understanding the crimes it produces. Cities shape crime, not through some mystical influence, though the mythology is not always resistant to the mystical, but through the entirely practical mechanisms of architecture and economics and political history and the distribution of resources. Gotham's crime is not random. It is not the product of individual moral failures occurring in a vacuum. It is the product of a city that has, through specific decisions made by specific people at specific historical moments, created the conditions in which crime is not just possible, but in many ways, inevitable. Batman understands this. He has investigated it the way he investigates everything, systematically, with patience, assembling the evidence from disparate sources into a coherent picture. The Wayne family's own history is part of that picture, the specific ways that the Wayne fortune was built, the decisions Thomas Wayne's father made, the decisions Thomas Wayne himself made, the ways that wealth operates in a city that does not have enough of it, and the specific moral complications that accumulate when a single family controls enough resources to be either genuinely beneficial or merely self-serving. Bruce Wayne has had to investigate his own inheritance, to look at the Wayne fortune, which funds everything, which is the material basis of the entire project, and ask what it is built on. This is not a comfortable investigation. The answer, when it arrives, is not simple. The fortune is built on things that were good, and on things that were not good, and on things that were the particular mixture of good and not good that most large accumulations of capital represent when examined honestly. Batman uses the fortune. He uses it deliberately and with awareness of what it is. He does not pretend it is clean, and he does not reject it as irredeemably compromised. He does what the best people in his position do with inherited resources that carry complicated histories. He tries to use it better than it was used to build it. The investigation of Gotham as a system, as a place with a history that produces its present, has led Batman to some of the most significant cases in the mythology. Not cases involving individual criminals, cases involving structures. The specific ways that corruption had embedded itself in the city's institutions. Not just the obvious corruption, the police officers on mob payrolls, the politicians who looked away from organized crime in exchange for campaign contributions, but the deeper, more structural corruption. The ways that the rules themselves had been written to favor certain people over others. The legal frameworks that appeared neutral but had specific beneficiaries built into their architecture. Investigating this kind of corruption requires different tools than investigating a murder. No crime scene, no body, no forensic evidence in the conventional sense. Documents, records, the specific, unsexy work of reading legislative history and financial disclosures, and the minutes of meetings that were designed to be dull enough that no one would look at them carefully. Batman has done this work. In the mythology, in the versions of the character that engage with Gotham as a real urban system rather than simply as a backdrop for action, he is depicted doing this work. Late at night in the Batcave, not in costume, just a person at a computer reading documents. Unglamorous, essential, because the crime that is built into the structure is harder to fight than the crime on the street. The person with the gun can be stopped. The system that produces the conditions in which the person picks up the gun, that takes a different kind of investigation and a different kind of response. Batman has not solved Gotham. No one can solve a city. Cities are not puzzles with solutions. They are ongoing, dynamic, contradictory human constructions that resist resolution the way living things resist being fully known. But he has understood more of it than anyone, has assembled the most comprehensive picture available of why this particular city is this particular way. And that understanding informs every case, every decision about where to look and who to suspect, and which connections are real and which are coincidental. The city is the case. All the individual cases are chapters within it. The case of the invisible man. This is a case that exists in the mythology, in fragments, in references and in descriptions, more than in a single complete telling. But the fragments, assembled, describe one of the most purely investigative achievements in Batman's record. A crime had been committed. The crime itself was not in question. The evidence of the crime was clear and extensive. Property damage on a significant scale, financial harm to a number of specific parties, a clear pattern of deliberate and sophisticated action. What was not clear, what every investigative effort had failed to establish, was who had done it. Not in the sense of having suspects and being unable to choose between them, in the more unsettling sense of having no suspects at all. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no financial traces, no communication records, no surveillance footage, which was, in itself, unusual in a city that had, by this point in the mythology, installed a fairly comprehensive surveillance infrastructure. No evidence of a person at all, which should be impossible. Because the crime, the specific series of actions required to produce the outcome that was clearly visible, required a person, required physical presence, required interaction with the material world in ways that always leave evidence. Unless the evidence had been removed, not hidden or obscured, actually removed. Every trace, every contact point, every surface that a person acting in this space would inevitably have touched or moved or breathed near. This would require a specific kind of knowledge, not just about how to commit the crime, but about forensic evidence collection, about what traces are typically left and what analysis is typically performed, and what the specific capabilities of the investigative team that would respond to this kind of event actually were. Intimate knowledge, professional knowledge, the knowledge of someone who worked in forensic investigation. Batman had his direction, not a name, not a suspect, a category. Someone with specific forensic training, someone with access to the right materials and techniques, someone whose professional life had given them the very specific expertise required to make a person invisible at a crime scene. He worked the category, identified every person in the relevant metropolitan area with the specific combination of qualifications and access and opportunity. Not a short list. There were more people with forensic backgrounds in Gotham than might be expected, given the city's particular relationship with crime, but a manageable one. And then he applied the secondary filter, motive, because forensic expertise explained how the crime could have been committed without leaving traces. It did not explain why. And the why, the specific goal the crime served, was itself a data point. The crime had benefited specific parties, harmed specific parties. The distribution of benefit and harm was not random and not obvious, but with the right financial analysis, it was traceable. Batman traced it, through layers of financial structure that were sophisticated enough to require time, but not sophisticated enough to withstand the specific quality of attention he was applying. And at the intersection of forensic expertise and financial motive, there was one name, one person. Not a figure from Gotham's criminal world, not a name that meant anything in the existing mythology of the city's crime, just a person, with a career and a specific financial situation, and a decision point 3 years prior, where certain things had gone wrong, and certain other things had followed from that. The Invisible Man. Visible, after all. Just requiring a specific kind of looking, the kind that does not start from what is present and work outward, the kind that starts from what should be present and isn't, and asks, where did it go? And who took it? We have been talking for most of this night about Batman as a solitary figure. And he is, in many respects, and in many versions of the mythology, most naturally understood as solitary. But the mythology includes partners, and the partners change the detective work, in ways that the solitary framing tends to obscure. Dick Grayson, the first Robin. The mythology of Dick Grayson's arrival in Bruce Wayne's life is one of the most significant moments in the entire Batman canon. Not just emotionally, though it is deeply emotional, but methodologically. Because Dick Grayson changed how Batman investigated. Not by adding physical capability. Batman already had extraordinary physical capability. Not by adding emotional warmth, though the relationship did that too, and that is its own kind of important, but by adding a different kind of mind. Dick Grayson is, in the mythology, brilliant in ways that are different from Bruce Wayne's brilliance. Where Bruce Wayne's mind is systematic and comprehensive, the mind that builds the archive, constructs the profile, follows the evidence chain step by careful step. Dick Grayson's mind is intuitive and connective. It sees patterns not through systematic analysis, but through a kind of direct apprehension, the way a person who is constitutionally good at seeing shapes recognizes a face in a crowd without being able to articulate how they did it. He is also, at the emotional level, more open, more willing to engage with the people involved in a case, witnesses, victims, bystanders, in a way that produces a different kind of information. The kind of information that does not appear in forensic analysis. The things that people tell someone they trust, that they would never tell someone they fear. Batman, in many contexts, is someone people fear. This is largely intentional, but it means he misses things. A frightened witness gives you the minimum, enough to satisfy the inquiry without giving away anything they think might put them at risk. A trusted interlocutor, someone who feels seen and safe, gives you the things they weren't even sure were important. The side details, the peripheral observations that they didn't think mattered, but that sometimes turn out to matter enormously. Dick Grayson could talk to people. and what he brought back from those conversations filled in the spaces that forensic analysis left empty. Working with Robin, specifically with Dick Grayson, though the subsequent Robins each added something different, taught Batman something about the limitations of his own approach. Taught him that a methodology, however comprehensive, reflects the mind that built it. And the mind that built it has blind spots, not because it is inadequate, because it is specific, because every powerful intelligence has its particular strengths and its particular forms of not seeing. The comprehensive, archival, systematic mind does not always notice what the intuitive mind notices first. The intuitive mind does not always follow the chain that the systematic mind follows to its end. Together, they covered more ground. Together, they were closer to complete than either was alone. Batman would not admit this easily. The mythology is honest about his reluctance, about the specific psychological difficulty of acknowledging that the solitary methodology, built over years of personal effort and personal sacrifice, benefits from company. But the cases showed it. The resolution rates, the speed, the specific quality of the solutions, the completeness of them, the sense that every thread had been followed rather than the most important ones. Better with Robin than without. The Batman and Robin dynamic has been described, in the mythology's more self-aware moments, as a kind of intellectual ecosystem. Two organisms in a relationship of mutual benefit that neither fully designed and neither could have predicted. Where Batman provides the framework and Robin provides the disruption. Not in a destructive sense, in the sense that the best intellectual partnerships disrupt, that having a genuinely different mind engaged with the same problem produces solutions that neither mind alone would have reached. The detective is better when he is not entirely alone. Even if he sometimes forgets this, even if the mythology, in its darker periods, shows him retreating back to solitude after loss. He always comes back to the partnership, to the acknowledgement that the work is better shared. Because the cases show it. The cases always show it. Some cases do not resolve quickly. This is, in popular depictions of detective work, often elided. The narrative convention wants the resolution to come at the end of the story, the case to close within the frame. But real detective work, and Batman's detective work in the versions of the mythology that take it seriously, does not always conform to narrative convenience. Some cases take years. Some cases are maintained in the background of other cases, active but not primary, pursued in the margins of the work, the way a scientist maintains a long-term experiment while conducting other research in the foreground. And some of those long-game cases, when they finally resolve, produce conclusions that are more significant than any individual short-term resolution, because they reveal the shape of something, a conspiracy, a system, a relationship between events that seemed unconnected, that could not be seen from within any single case. The long-game cases in Batman's mythology tend to involve the most powerful adversaries, not the most physically dangerous, though there is often overlap, the most systematically dangerous. The people who operate not through individual criminal acts, but through the construction of systems that produce criminal outcomes while maintaining a surface of legality and respectability. Ra's al Ghul. Ra's al Ghul is, in the mythology, the longest game, a figure who has been planning, in the most extreme versions of the mythology, for centuries, and whose operations are global in scale and deliberately obscured behind layers of organizational complexity that make any single investigation see only a fragment. Batman's investigation of Ra's al Ghul and the League of Shadows is the longest case in the archive. Not a single investigation, but a connected series of investigations across years, each one revealing a new layer, each resolution opening onto a new depth, each moment of what seems like a conclusion, demonstrating that the conclusion was a landing point on a staircase that continues downward. The methodology required to pursue this kind of case is different from the methodology for a single crime. It requires the maintenance of connection, the ability to hold threads from cases years apart and recognize when a new development illuminates an old one. It requires patience in a register that goes beyond the professional, not just the willingness to wait for information, the willingness to pursue a case whose resolution is not visible from where you currently stand. It requires the specific intellectual humility of acknowledging that what you currently know is a small fraction of what is true. Batman maintains this case the way an astronomer maintains observation of a slow-moving celestial body, periodically, systematically, with the knowledge that the picture builds over time, and that impatience, the desire to force a resolution before the evidence supports one, produces wrong conclusions. Raj Al Ghul respects this. In the mythology, the relationship between Raj Al Ghul and Batman has a quality that is different from the relationship between Batman and any other adversary. It is, in its way, a form of mutual recognition. Raj Al Ghul has lived long enough, in the mythology far longer than any ordinary human life, to have encountered many investigators, many people who attempted to understand and counter his operations. None of them, until Batman, maintained the investigation for long enough to build a genuine picture. The others fell away, ran out of resources, ran out of will, were redirected by institutional priorities or personal limitations, or the ordinary human difficulty of sustaining an obsession across years and decades without tangible progress. Batman did not fall away, and Raj Al Ghul, who has in the mythology a specific and complicated response to genuinely extraordinary human beings, takes notice. The respect is not comfortable for either of them. For Batman, because Raj Al Ghul's respect does not come without strings, does not come without the offer of something, succession, partnership, the specific continuation that Raj Al Ghul's particular access to extended life makes possible. And Batman refuses. Not because he does not understand the offer, not because he is unaware of what it would mean, but because the methodology, the whole framework built around the idea that truth matters, that evidence matters, that the line between investigation and judgment cannot be crossed without losing something essential, is incompatible with what Raj Al Ghul represents. Raj Al Ghul's project is not justice. It is not even order, in any sense that shares meaning with the word as Batman uses it. It is something else. Something that looks, from a sufficient distance, like a vision of improvement, but that, examined closely, with the specific quality of attention that Batman brings to everything, reveals itself to be something far colder. The conviction that the world is a problem to be solved, and that the person solving it gets to define what the solution looks like. Batman knows the feeling. The specific, consuming feeling of believing that if you could just understand enough, control enough, anticipate enough, then the thing that happened in that alley would stop happening to other people. He knows the feeling because he has it, has had it since he was 8 years old. The difference between him and Raj Al Ghul is not that he lacks the feeling. It is that he has chosen, consciously, repeatedly, in the face of every temptation, to act within limits, to let the evidence determine the conclusions, to let the conclusions determine the action, to let the action be proportionate, constrained, subject to a framework of values that existed before the feeling and that will continue to exist after any particular case is resolved. This choice, to be a detective rather than a force of nature, is the central discipline of Bruce Wayne's life. More central than any physical discipline, more demanding than any intellectual one. The choice to know before you act, to be sure before you move, to hold the feeling, the urgent, overwhelming, righteous feeling, at the precise distance that prevents it from distorting the investigation. We are near the end of tonight's journey. Not because the cases are exhausted. The cases are not exhausted. The mythology is too large, too varied, too continuously expanding for any single evening to contain all of it. But we have covered enough to have assembled a picture of what Batman's detective work actually is, of where it came from, and what it costs, and what it produces, of the specific quality of attention and discipline and willingness to be wrong, and capacity for empathy that combine in one person through one extraordinary act of sustained self-construction into the thing the title describes: the world's greatest detective. Let us sit with that title for a moment before we let the night take over. It is a strange title for a person like Bruce Wayne, because Bruce Wayne is, in the deepest sense, not a person who wanted to be great. Greatness was not the project. The project was simpler and much harder than greatness. The project was understand what happened. Understand what happened well enough to prevent it from happening again, to someone else, to the specific, irreplaceable, particular someone else who is alive now and who might not be if the thing that happened in Crime Alley happens again in whatever form it takes next. The detective work is not about brilliance, not primarily. The brilliance is real. Batman is genuinely, substantively, extraordinarily intelligent, and that intelligence is a resource the work depends on. But intelligence without the other things, without the observation and the memory and the willingness to be wrong, and the empathy and the patience and the specific moral discipline of staying within the framework, intelligence alone produces wrong conclusions very efficiently. What makes Batman the greatest detective is not the individual qualities, it is the integration. The way the qualities work together, reinforce each other, check each other, produce in their interaction something that is greater than any of them alone. The observation that feeds the memory that informs the deduction checked by the empathy, by the question of whether the conclusion makes sense from the inside of the person it is about. The empathy disciplined by the evidence, by the refusal to let what you feel about a person override what the evidence shows. All of it held within the framework, the specific, chosen, continuously renewed commitment to certain values about what investigation is for and how it should be conducted. It is a life's work, not a career, not a phase, a life. Bruce Wayne has given his life to this, not in the sense of giving it up, though that interpretation is available and the mythology sometimes takes it, in the sense of filling it, of building a life whose contents are, as completely as possible, this work. And the cases, the specific, numbered, documented, legendary cases that this night has been about, are the evidence of that. The record, the accumulation of instances in which a problem that seemed complete, that seemed to have been designed to resist solution, turned out under one particular quality of sustained attention to have been solvable. Not easily, not quickly, not without cost, but solvable. There is a version of the Batman mythology, one that exists at the edges of the canon, in the interpretive spaces between the official texts, that proposes something interesting. The proposition is this: Batman is not, primarily, a superhero. He is a detective who operates in a world that requires superhero methods. The cape and the cowl and the physical capability and the darkness and the fear-based operational methodology, all of this is, in this interpretation, the adaptation of a detective to an environment that is, by any reasonable standard, far more extreme than the environment classical detective fiction imagined its investigators working in. Sherlock Holmes did not face opponents who could level city blocks. Hercule Poirot did not investigate crimes in a city run partly by a criminal ecosystem that included people with supernatural capabilities. Philip Marlowe navigated a corrupt city, but Gotham's corruption is structural in ways that Chandler's Los Angeles, for all its darkness, was not. Batman is a detective who had to become something more than a conventional detective because the problems required it. Not more powerful, more capable across more dimensions, more disciplined in more directions simultaneously, more willing to go into more uncomfortable places, psychological, moral, physical, in the service of the investigation. And the detective work, the core of it, the essential practice of following evidence to truth, remained constant through all of it. The foundation, under everything. When the mythology works best, when the writers and artists and storytellers working with this character produce something that feels genuinely worthy of his complexity, it is because they have understood this. That the detective is the heart of it. That the mystery, the specific, disciplined, evidence-based pursuit of truth through a world that does not make truth easy to find, is not just one element of Batman among many. It is the thing, the central practice, the discipline that everything else serves. There is a moment in the Batcave. Not a dramatic moment, not the arrival of a new case or the departure toward a confrontation or any of the moments that fill the mythology with movement and urgency. A quiet moment. After the case is closed, after the evidence has been assembled and delivered or documented or both, after the person responsible has been contained or resolved or brought to whatever accounting the specific situation allowed for, after the night's work is done. Bruce Wayne is in the cave, not in costume, or perhaps still in the process of not being in costume. The transition from one state to the other happening in the particular unhurried way it does when there is no immediate urgency. The computers are running. They are always running. Processing, sorting, correlating. The city's information flowing through systems that Batman designed to maintain continuous awareness even when he is not actively directing it. Alfred, perhaps, nearby. Perhaps not. In some of these moments, Alfred is asleep, because Alfred is human in ways that Bruce Wayne sometimes forgets, and then feels the specific, complicated guilt of forgetting. But sometimes present, moving quietly, making the particular domestic sounds of care being provided without announcement. The bats, overhead. The colony that shares the cave, that has always shared it, that was here before Batman repurposed the space, that will be here in whatever form the cave takes after he no longer needs it. Their sounds, the specific ultrasonic navigation sounds that register at the edge of human hearing, filling the space with a quality of aliveness that the machinery, for all its sophistication, does not produce. Bruce Wayne sits. Just sits. Not planning the next case, not processing the last one, not training or reading or maintaining any of the dozens of ongoing projects that the mission continuously generates. Just sits. The detective at rest. This moment exists in the mythology. Not often. Not in the flashy, celebrated stories, but in the quieter ones. In the panels and the scenes that the best writers include because they understand that the relentlessness is real. But so is this. The need for stillness. The specific human requirement for a moment in which nothing is being asked. In which the mind, for once, does not have to produce anything. What is Bruce Wayne thinking in this moment? The mythology does not always tell us, and that is right. That is appropriate. Some moments should not be narrated. but we can imagine. Perhaps he is thinking about his parents, not with the specific urgency of the grief that drives the work, not the pain that has been transmuted into purpose, that has been alchemized over decades into this extraordinary and exhausting project. Just remembering the specific, ordinary quality of memory that a child retains of parents loved and lost. His father's laugh, his mother's perfume, the particular texture of being held by someone who is larger than you are when you are small and feeling entirely safe. Feeling perhaps, for a moment, safe. Or perhaps he is not thinking about anything in particular. Perhaps the mind, the extraordinary, relentless, cataloguing, connecting, pattern-finding mind, has, for a few minutes, gone quiet. Found the rest that it needs to continue, that any mind needs, however exceptional, however trained, however deeply committed to never stopping. Even the greatest detective sleeps, or approaches sleep, or sits in the particular state that is close enough to rest that it serves the same purpose. The rain falls outside. It always rains in Gotham, or almost always. The mythology gives the city a climate that is appropriate to its character, grey and wet and cold more often than not, the kind of weather that makes the interior feel more interior and the darkness feel more natural. The rain falls, the computers run, the bats move above, and Bruce Wayne is still, for a moment, just for a moment, before the next case. Tonight we have followed the detective through the cases, through the philosophy that underlies the work, through the early cases that built the methodology, through the hardest problems, the irrational, the compulsive, the intimate, through the long games and the invisible crimes and the investigations that turned inward, through the partnerships that expanded what was possible, through the city itself, the great ongoing case that contains all the others. And we end here, in the cave, in the quiet. Let that quiet take you now. You have followed the case as far as it goes tonight. The evidence has been examined. The conclusions have been drawn. Rest now. Let the rain do the rest. It knows how.